All right. So let me go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our Friday Digest. And I'm Kim Coble, Executive Director for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. As always, thank you for joining us. And as you know, our goal for these Friday Digest is to make sure that you have all the information and inspiration to take action on behalf of the priority bills that we're presenting and all the good uh, bills that are in front of the legislators that we're trying to get passed, as well as opposing some. So the point here is that you're the audience, and we want to make sure we're giving you the information you need to be engaged activists. So keep us posted. We'll have a survey at the end of the today's presentation that you can fill out. You can give us ideas on what you want to hear about, things that worked well, any other suggestions you have. So please keep us posted. And during the presentation today, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll try to take those up at the after the formal presentation. So that is the preamble that I'm always supposed to share. Um, I am really honored today to have Lisa Wanger join us. Dr. Lisa Wanger is with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Studies. And it was probably a couple months ago that Lisa and I met each other. She's an environmental economist, which is an area that's fascinating, and has a lot of experience in the field of how does the environment and the economy mix and what influences one or the other. Um, we hired, along with generous donation from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Studies and the Mizrahi Foundation, to conduct a study that pertains to the coal dust cleanup and asthma mitigation fund bill. We had talked about this bill a while ago. The what it does is it suggests a fee be placed on the tons of coal that are transported across Maryland. There's lots and lots of coal transported across Maryland. Let's put a fee on that. This would generate revenue, which the state needs. We're estimating around $300 million from a $13 per ton fee. Those funds would then support Maryland's work in the climate area, supporting climate action, climate programs. It specifically the bill specifically calls on 40% of those funds being spent in underserved and overburdened communities. It also creates a requirement that $5 million be spent on asthma treatment programs for residents living along the coal lines. The coal cars are not covered. Lots of coal dust comes off those cars. And ultimately, folks living near there, working near there, have coal dust and are breathing it in. So this bill would help address some of the health implications of those of that coal dust, breathing in the coal dust. So this study, one of the opposing arguments that has been made about this proposed fee, supported our sponsors, Delegate Stein, and is that it's going to really hurt the Maryland port, the Port of Baltimore, and which nobody wants. We don't want it. Nobody wants to impact the port. And we've talked with the port, and they are concerned about potential impacts. We thought it was important to have an independent study done that said what would be the impact, would be the potential impacts of such a fee on the port. And that's what Lisa and her colleagues did. And we have her here. I'm not going to speak for her. I'm going to ask her a lot of questions about it, but we're going to hear from the author of that study to make sure that we have a good understanding of it and the results, and hopefully be able to advocate for the bill, which has a hearing on Tuesday in the House. So with that backdrop, thanks for joining us, Lisa. Let me first ask you if you could give a brief overview of the study and what you looked at and why you think the research matters, and what you think the data was saying. So yeah. Just we'll start out right there.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And I just want to say, when we got the call from you to work on this study, it was pretty exciting because this is really the kind of study that environmental economists love to do. I know a lot of people don't really understand our field very well, but we're about using market forces to change behavior that helps the environment or produces other social goods. So it's right in line with the research I do. Uh, and so this idea of putting a fee on something that has external harms, uh, this is, to put that fee on is considered a highly effective method of internalizing an externality. And I've noticed that terminology has gotten to be fairly well understood, but I'll explain it just in case. So what we mean by that is you're trying to change the price of a good that creates a burden on those who are not directly engaged in the market transaction. So, you've got a coal business, they're selling to coal buyers, and it's almost really inadvertent in a sense that they're creating these external harms. And so the idea is to, you know, if you can extract money out of that transaction, then you can use that money to ameliorate those environmental or social bads that come from this market behavior. So it's one way to fix what we call a market failure. Uh, so so as Kim explained, the goal here was to generate funds, but there is also this possibility that this activity will change behavior by changing the cost of doing business and potentially the market price of coal. Um, but we analyzed just one potential behavior change, which was whether the proposed fee had the potential to divert coal exports from the Port of Baltimore to alternative ports. And we addressed that by considering how it would change their business costs. So we used what's called a spatial analysis using geographic information systems to examine the change in rail transport distances and cost if mines switched from using the Port of Baltimore to Norfolk or Hampton Roads. Also, I'm going to call it the Port of Virginia also to combine both of those. But those are where the coal terminals are. And you hear people talk about Norfolk and Hampton Roads mostly. Uh, and that we considered that as the only alternative port because we had already had this experiment of when the Port of Baltimore was closed, what happened to the coal. And a substantial portion of coal was diverted to Norfolk at that time. So that's what we analyzed. Um, but the tricky part of the analysis was that we needed to route trains to completely avoid Maryland because the fee applies even if you just pass through Maryland, not only if you use the Port of Baltimore. So in our spatial analysis, we needed to block out Maryland and then find the alternative routes for the mines. And so that had a big effect on the cost of transportation. So basically, if you can't go through Maryland, you're forced to take a train route that's to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. And depending on whether it's CSX or Norfolk Southern, you're going through Ohio, West Virginia, places like that. So what we found, in the end, doing this analysis, we plotted all the mines, we looked at their potential destinations, and these alternative routes add hundreds of miles to the transportation distance on the order of 400 to 800 miles. So from that, we needed to route trains. Right, and here's an example of that change in route. So yes, good timing on this slide. So the yellow line here is the distance from a place where a lot of coal comes from, the southwest area of Pennsylvania. And that yellow line is the route it would take to get to the Port of Baltimore on the CSX network. The blue line is the alternative route to Norfolk, also on the CSX network. And if you're on the Norfolk Southern Railroad, the difference is even greater. But the difference here in this picture is 462 miles. And so when you then calculate the cost, we applied a standard cost per mile, per ton mile, that we gathered from federal sources, and the increase of cost for that transportation difference was 14 and change to $38 per ton delivered. So the average increase for any mine was 27.40 per ton. And yes, this is a histogram of we analyzed 70 mines. I'll spare you the details of why there were 70 instead of the sort of 90 mines that are actually there. But of these 70 mines we analyzed, this is how many mines shown as the number in the blue bar. That's how many mines experienced that particular cost increase per short ton. So
And
you
as
see
you said, the average was $27,
the
right?
average was 27.
Okay.
And then when
Okay.
you take into account the volumes of coal being transported, so that gets multiplied by the tons, the cost per mine was as low as $1,600 and as high as 53 million. So
Okay. Great. Um, so Patrick, I'm going to hit your question head on. Was the $13 fee set based on this analysis? No. Uh, Delegate Dana Stein, who's the sponsor of the bill and has been a longtime champion of the environment and is on the Climate Commission, determined that $13 per ton was the fee that he wanted to propose in the bill. So this was as much about what he felt was the right level of um, revenue that would be generated versus what potentially could be harmful to the industries and the port. So it was his determination. It was 13.
yes, kind of a
Um,
funny coincidence.
yeah. Um, so Lisa, in this study, um, you looked at both northern and central Appalachian lines and coal mines. Can you describe a little bit about what the differences were there, why you did that, and kind of what the take home message was from each of those areas?
Yes, and also thank you for reminding me that analysis you just saw was only for the northern Appalachian region, which is for the most part Pennsylvania and West Virginia as the source of coal. And then central Appalachia includes uh, Kentucky, Virginia, Southwest Virginia, and northern Tennessee. And uh, to be honest, everyone we talked to said uh, all the coal being exported out of Baltimore is from northern Appalachia, and the experts being federal employees and academics. But we also had some people in the business that were telling us things, and this is before they really knew what the analysis was about, and I don't think they were answering strategically. And they told us that some of the coal comes from Kentucky. So that's why we analyzed both northern and central Appalachia distances, but the answers for Central Appalachia look very different. So this is Northern Appalachia rerouting here. Central Appalachian coal, and the reason most of the experts think that not much coal from Central Appalachia goes through the Port of Baltimore is because it's already farther than going to Norfolk or Hampton Roads. So we don't exactly know why coal would go from Kentucky to Baltimore. It could maybe they're getting a break on the transportation costs. Maybe there's some other logistical reason. We don't know, but we do think whatever this small amount of coal that appears to arise from Central Appalachia would probably be the most likely to divert to the Port of
Okay.
Virginia because it's already seemingly more expensive to use the Port of Baltimore. So when you add, 13 more dollars on it, probably is going to become uneconomical to make that trip.
And just to make sure I heard you correctly, that this part from Central Appalachia, though, is really a small percentage of the total coal that comes through the port of Baltimore. Is that correct?
To the best that we can discern, right?
Okay.
Private business dealings are not in the public domain,
Mhm.
but it just doesn't appear to make much sense to ship large amounts from Kentucky. And
Yeah.
and we talked to someone at the University of Kentucky, and he said that coal mining has really been diminishing over time. So there just didn't seem to be any indication that this was a large volume of coal.
Okay. All right. Great. Um, so let's turn to the other point that you made in your introduction and that is the relationship about environmental fees and whether they can hurt business or cause an economic disruption. Um, and what's the play between that? Because if I heard you correctly, you were making the point that there could be behavior change that could come from this as well, um, or there could be some upsides. The downside is it would cost the companies more money, but not enough to have them go to a different port. But what are some of the upsides as an environmental economist that you would see from this fee?
Right. So, we often see that these fees also tend to diminish the use of the good, which, I don't think any of us are terribly opposed to using less coal, but the problem becomes, what does that actually do to business relationships and things like that. So, um, if you just look at kind of the economics of it, so the $13 fee would be about an 18% would be 18% of the current selling price of coal, which we again got from experts, would be about $70 per short ton of the type of coal that gets exported from Baltimore, because there's lots of different varieties of coal. They vary in their price based on their embedded BTUs and other factors. So, we have high uncertainty around that $70, but that, two people gave us that number as a ballpark estimate, so it seems reasonable. So 18% is not nothing. So this creates basically two unknowns. So will the mines be able to absorb that cost, or will they need to increase prices? That's question number one. And then question number two is, if they increase the prices, will buyers still buy as much coal? And so, what for economists study market behavior, and a general principle that we have is that when price goes up, demand goes down. That's just a sort of basic understanding. But there's also lots of reasons why that doesn't hold. So, it depends on what other sellers can offer. Do they have what prices are they offering coal at? Do they have the volume that the buyer needs? Some things are more elastic. We say we have higher price elasticity. So maybe some of you heard about the coffee prices increasing. And so there's a case where coffee is price inelastic. So the price went up, people still kept buying as much. So there's reasons why markets don't necessarily work that way, but it is a general principle. So it's something that we would want, you'd want to be concerned about probably. So.
Okay. All right. Good point. And you touched on this as well in the beginning, but let's go back to when the Key Bridge collapsed. Can you walk us through what we actually saw, specifically around coal shipments during that time?
Yeah, it was really great. I mean, it was a terrible tragedy, of course, but it was great for our analysis to have this natural experiment. So, and really, we were able to glean a lot of information from news reports from Consol Energy, and they're the company that produces a lot of the coal that's exported out of Baltimore. They own and operate several of the mines in Southwest Pennsylvania, and they also own and operate a coal pier at the Port of Baltimore. So they're a big player in all this. And so their behavior is indicative of the industry. And they diverted some of their coal to Norfolk during this time. They also stockpiled coal at Baltimore with the intention of sending it out when the port reopened. And then um, they also, just a couple months after the port reopened, volumes of coal leaving Baltimore were back to normal, or even higher, because they were trying to make up some difference. So, that suggests to us that, and also from news reports, we know it did cost them more money to go to Norfolk, even when they were using the most efficient route, which is through Maryland. They said it cost them about $10 more per ton to do that. So that's kind of a good little verification that the cost is substantial. And and the fact that they went back to using Baltimore means that that's their preference and probably the most economical approach for them. So that's
Yeah, no, definitely I'll own this, and I'm not an expert in this area at all, but I did feel that the impact was pretty minimal. And then as soon as they were able, they went back to Baltimore in the beginning from so it
right.
I think economically it seemed to make a lot of sense to continue to use Baltimore. So I
Right. Despite there being excess capacity in Norfolk. So that's the other thing it taught us is that if Norfolk wanted to, it could export more coal. Uh, so
good
so
point.
yeah, so obviously people are choosing Baltimore for a good reason.
Right, right. Yeah, even though there is more capacity down there. So um I in the spirit of being having a little bit of scientific training behind me, what about your study would you say are limitations, or well, let me put it this way: if we were to have the next round of questions, what do you think are the important questions that we should be asking about this situation?
Right. What I thought you were going to say is if you hired an expert to tear my study apart, what would they say? Because there's every scientific study can be criticized, as you know. So, but we are honest about the things we are uncertain about. So, um, we don't really know the true transport costs. We're basing it on an average transport cost for the region. But what we understand is, mines have specific contracts to, I'm going to ship a certain volume at this distance, and then they get an agreement with the railroad of how much it's going to cost. So we know we don't have the cost exactly right for every mine. So that's an issue. But as you can see, even if we were a little bit wrong, the distances are so large. I don't think it really changes the findings. So that's one thing. And then um, there's a lot of uncertainties about the market conditions, right? This $70 per ton that we got from the experts is below the national average price for thermal coal, it's called. So the kind of coal, the majority of coal that's exported out of Baltimore is called thermal coal, which is the cheaper, generally cheaper coal than the anthracite coal, or the metallurgical coal they call it. And so the it's possible that there is some capacity to increase the price. It's hard to say, but so yeah, you'd have to study a lot more and interview a lot more experts to really know the answer to that question. But
Okay.
but apparently there's also coal selling for higher price. But like I said, every ton really has its own price in a sense of, this is like thermal coal also goes as low as the 30s. So dollars per ton, short ton. So we really, don't know the details of the qualities of the coal and what price they're fetching and what the competition looks like on the global marketplace.
Right. Okay. Um, and I don't know if I know the study, we didn't bring this into this study, but one of the arguments that the port is making as a concern is that each port has different financing structures as well. So, right. So that for their tonnage, which is really their denominator of importance, there's all different ways that they put place cost to that. Do you know anything about that, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, let me first just touch on kind of one little obvious thing, which is, if a mine had to switch from using their own coal terminal to somebody else's coal terminal, we understand those fees are fairly nominal compared to the transportation costs. So we basically ignored that. There were also reasons to think that they wouldn't incur extra fees. I'll again spare you the details. You can read the report if you really want them. Uh, but bigger picture, yeah, the Port of Baltimore has a little bit of a tough situation because they're fairly inland in a sense. Like Norfolk is basically right on the ocean. Baltimore, you have to, you know, navigate all the way up the Chesapeake Bay into the harbor, get to the berth. And all those channels have to be dredged and that material placed. And we've worked for a long time on the dredge material maintenance program, looking into the benefits and how to do environmental good with the dredge material and things like that. So um, the there is an issue if the volume of port exports, whatever they may be, if they lost a lot of business, they could potentially have trouble getting the federal cost share to maintain those channels because you need a certain benefit cost ratio, and that benefit cost ratio is based on how much business you're doing. So how many ships come in. And then they would potentially lose the capacity to accept the really deep draft vessels, which a lot of companies are going to for, consumer goods with these container vessels, not only consumer goods, but that's a big thing. So that's a disruption risk if they
Mhm.
were to lose a big volume of exports and it weren't replaced by something else, so these are all the
Right.
uncertainties. Yeah.
Yeah, I learned an interesting thing from the port when we talked to him about you had mentioned the dredging, and obviously that's a huge expense and practice, and that's actually done by the federal government. I mean, they Army Corps of Engineers pays for that, so it's not
They cost share it, is my understanding. Did you hear that they fully paid for it? Oh,
yes.
okay. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. In general, they cost share, but maybe they do pay for this. Okay.
Right. For the example that we were provided was 100%. Because one of the things that we were saying is like maybe we can use some of this revenue generation to assist in paying for the dredging, so that it could be a win-win. So we were told that don't have that expense. It's actually a federal expense. So
Oh, I see. Okay.
just sharing that with the audience too. Let me circle around on one thing and then we'll get to questions. But it's really an important part of the bill, and that is that the money that is going to overburden communities and to the asthma treatment. Given your experience as an environmental economist, how important is it to target the funds for this approach? And are you familiar with other situations you've been involved in that have done this?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I don't know that much about health interventions. So, I mean, that's not my area of expertise. So, but I do think there are some generalizable things from the kind of programs I have looked at, like things like maybe in lieu fee systems for well-in mitigation, or I've learned a few things from watching these programs. I do think they are generalizable. Um, so, and then I'll get back to the targeting disadvantaged communities or overburdened communities in a minute. But first of all, when you're creating a fund that you want to dispense in an optimal way, something that seems to pervade all these programs is that it's really, especially when it's a community-based program, uh, it's really important to build on existing programs and use community actors who have trust. And the big mistake seems to be, okay, we created a whole new program that's going to come in and do this thing. And that seems to be that's kind of a leading indicator of less success.
Hmm.
So that's what I can offer there. In terms
Okay.
of targeting underserved or overburdened communities, obviously ethically, that can be a strong argument, but also there's an issue with economics really fails in a lot of ways to help produce fair outcomes for disadvantaged communities, because when you rely on benefit cost analysis, you're using things like income or house price or something to judge the value you're getting, and of course that's always going to disadvantage communities who have lower incomes and lower cost housing. And of course we're trying to fix that, we're trying to work on methods to fix that, but we haven't really been able to come to consensus in a
Mm.
way that really brings that to the fore. So I think having those kind of goals of just, we think this is the right thing to do, I think that really does help, especially if you can really manage to make that work. FEMA's trying to do it, for example, but they still use benefit cost criterion that get in their way. So as long as you don't put up impediments to it, I think it's a really effective way to make sure the benefits are delivered where they're needed the most.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Great. Let me, in the last few minutes, I want to, there's some questions about the fee and whether it can be, well, one is, can you cover the coal cars? And our research has indicated that that is a federally um, mandated or practice or not practice, right? Because it goes from state to state to state. So Maryland could say, well, you have to cover the coal cars in Maryland, but obviously the interstate commerce law wouldn't protect that, wouldn't implement that. So we don't have the ability to require that in this legislation. The other one I wanted to hit was the whether or not the fee could be put on ratepayers, or would we see it? So the fee would be placed on the company that is transporting the coal. So they likely would pass it on to the coal mine, the producers of the coal, and or maybe the export of the coal. So it is not likely that we would see that in Maryland as Marylanders. It wouldn't be passed on to us. Let me see what else we've got. Some and the revenue would be we're estimating around 300 million a year, so it's um not not a small amount. Then given the push for reducing federal spending, um what if the federal support for the dredging goes away? Have you had any conversations with anybody about that, Lisa?
I really haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't speak to that.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's speculation for all of us at this point. Lisa, thank you very much for joining us. I can't tell you how proud I am that we could bring on such a well-regarded and well-respected expert on this, and we look forward to having you join us at the hearing. So if anybody's watching next Tuesday at the hearing, we will be there. There'll be quite a lineup. And as always, fill out the questionnaire and the survey at the end of this. Thank you all for joining us, and happy Friday.